The true battle for West Africa is no longer confined to the arid stretches of the Sahel. It is being decisively engineered at the deep-water port of Lome, Togo, where a quiet but monumental military and logistical agreement between Russia and Togo has just forged an unbreakable supply corridor for the alliance of Sahel states. Did the traditional Western powers and legacy blocs like ECOWAS genuinely believe that economic blockades, closed borders, and weaponized sanctions would quietly suffocate these landlocked nations into submission? Or did their deliberate strategy of isolation inadvertently act as the ultimate catalyst, forcing Africa to weaponize its own logistical geography and forge a sovereign shield stronger than any colonial mandate? For Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the leadership of the AES, the vulnerability of inland supply lines was never a death sentence, but rather an urgent call for tactical evolution. Instead of waiting for their central command structures to be paralyzed by external pressure or orchestrated disruptions, they applied a rigorous doctrine of sovereign discipline, securing a resilient secondary logistical anchor on the Gulf of Guinea that effectively bypasses decades of forced dependency. We are witnessing a serious diplomatic shock that is rewriting the economic map of a continent. So hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let your voice be heard in the comments below. Is a fully self-reliant, logistically sovereign Africa the greatest geopolitical nightmare of the old global order? To understand the gravity of this geopolitical pivot, we must first strip away the prevailing narratives that have clouded the reality of West African independence. For generations, the ultimate leverage held over landlocked African nations, specifically Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, was the implicit threat of the closed door. The traditional architecture of global power dictates that if a nation does not control a coastline, its sovereignty is inherently conditional. It exists on a leash, held by coastal neighbors who have historically been heavily influenced by Paris, London, or Washington. When the alliance of Sahel states made the decisive decision to step away from the ECOWAS bloc, they were immediately met with an ultimatum of economic and logistical warfare. Borders were sealed, trade routes were deliberately bottlenecked, and sovereign financial assets were frozen. The invisible hand of foreign influence attempted to orchestrate a rapid institutional collapse by simply cutting off the oxygen of trade, civilian resources, and military supply. But what the old order failed to anticipate was how radically the mindset in the Sahel had shifted. The recent legislative ratification of a comprehensive military agreement between Russia and Togo, a process meticulously finalized in the quiet corridors of Parliament, serves as a revealing moment in this ongoing struggle. On paper, Western analysts might read the clauses regarding military exercises, intelligence sharing, and counter-piracy operations and dismiss them as standard diplomatic boilerplate. However, viewing this through the deeply historical lens of African liberation reveals a profound tactical evolution. This is not merely a bilateral treaty. It is the construction of a logistical fortress. The necessity of this fortress became undeniable following orchestrated disruptions at critical inland hubs, such as the targeting of Niamey International Airport and the adjacent airbase 101. These coordinated pressure points were designed to expose the physical vulnerability of a landlocked alliance. When your primary hubs of defense and supply are clustered entirely inland, a single concentrated disruption can theoretically sever the arteries of a nation's defensive capabilities. Yet, instead of reacting with the panic that foreign intelligence agencies anticipated, the AES leadership, echoing the calm resolve of Ibrahim Traoré, recognized this as an empirical data point requiring immediate structural correction. They understood that true sovereignty cannot be defended if the physical components of that defense, the The spare parts, the heavy machinery, the logistical fuel are trapped in a vulnerable, easily targeted corridor. Thus, the selection of Lome is a masterstroke of geopolitical realignment. Lome is not just a harbor. It is one of the premier deep-water ports in the entire Gulf of Guinea. By securing a reliable, sovereign-aligned transit and defense network through Togo, the AES has effectively opened a second door to the world, a door that cannot be unilaterally slammed shut by Western dictates or regional proxies acting on behalf of former colonizers. This strategic maneuver completely neutralizes the threat of an economic blockade. When a massive cargo vessel bypasses the historically utilized ports in the region to dock safely and securely in Lome, it is not an act of foreign occupation, as some alarmist Western headlines might suggest. Rather, it represents the activation of a secondary logistical corridor that guarantees the physical survival and operational readiness of the Sahelian states. Russia, in this specific context, operates strictly as a tactical partner, facilitating the physical infrastructure and security apparatus required to sustain an independent African posture. The presence of international partners at this port serves to reinforce a defensive architecture, ensuring that the critical supply chains reaching up into Burkina Faso and beyond remain entirely uninterrupted by the weaponized policies of the West. This represents the ultimate application of sovereign discipline, recognizing a geographic vulnerability left behind by colonial borders, and methodically engineering a permanent, unassailable solution that secures the future of the continent. The mindset that conceived this logistical fortress did not emerge overnight. It is the deliberate, unflinching application of sovereign discipline, a governing philosophy that Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the AES leadership have seamlessly integrated into every strategic decision. When legacy political analysts and Western media outlets first observed this calculated shift toward Lome, they hastily mischaracterized it. Bound by an outdated worldview, they framed it as a panicked retreat, an alliance scrambling for a lifeline after enduring localized disruptions. They projected their own historical assumptions onto a completely new generation of African leadership, assuming that any deviation from the established, Francophone-dominated economic corridors must inevitably be an act of desperation. This was a profound miscalculation. What the global community was actually witnessing was a highly sophisticated tactical evolution. For decades, the structural design of West African infrastructure was inherently extroverted. It was engineered not to connect African nations to one another, but to extract raw materials and transport them as swiftly as possible to European markets. Inland nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were kept deliberately dependent, their economic lifelines held hostage by the goodwill of coastal political blocs that remained heavily influenced by Paris and Washington. By bypassing these traditional, compromised corridors where trade could be halted by a single phone call from a foreign embassy, and forging a direct protected artery through Togo, the AES is systematically dismantling that neo-colonial architecture. This maneuver is not a flight from danger. It is a manifestation of strategic foresight. It reclaims the fundamental sovereign right to dictate exactly how, where, and with whom a nation conducts its essential commerce and defense. The leadership in Niamey, Bamako, and Ouagadougou is flatly refusing to let the invisible hand of foreign capital dictate the terms of their survival. Instead, they are actively constructing a self-sustaining geopolitical ecosystem where African nations rely on localized strength and strategic, mutually beneficial partnerships rather than external charity or conditional aid. The resulting posture is one of deep, unshakable calm. It reflects a profound realization that true power is not found in aggressive rhetoric or reactionary measures, but in the quiet, methodical, and irreversible assembly of infrastructure that cannot be sanctioned away. To truly comprehend the sheer magnitude of this geopolitical shift, one must look beyond the parliamentary documents, the defense treaties, and the high-level diplomatic handshakes. One must look closely at the asphalt, the convoys, and the working-class individuals physically turning the wheels of this new era. Consider Usman, a second-generation long-haul trucker, whose family has navigated the treacherous, dust-choked routes of West Africa for decades. For his father, driving the main arteries from the coast up into Ouagadougou was historically an exercise in enduring systemic humiliation. The old logistical corridors, heavily regulated by legacy blocks, were choked with arbitrary checkpoints, exploitative customs fees, and the constant looming threat of sudden border closures dictated by political spats in distant, foreign-aligned capitals. It was an infrastructure meticulously designed to extract wealth, punish dissent, and exert control over the working class. But today, the reality unfolding behind Usman's windshield has profoundly shifted. As he guides his massive transport vehicle out of the bustling deep-water port of Lome, the cargo he carries is distinctly different in its strategic weight. He is not just transporting commercial consumer goods. He is hauling the vital mechanical components, the sovereign assets, and the heavy logistical equipment required to maintain Burkina Faso's defensive capabilities and economic independence. He is navigating a newly secured corridor that operates under a fundamentally different set of rules. This route is now shielded by a sovereign logistical alliance, fortified by the strategic military partnership that guarantees the safe, unhindered transit of essential national supplies. The daily harassment at artificial, colonial-era borders is steadily being replaced by a unified, disciplined movement of goods. For Usman, this is no longer merely a grueling job of hauling freight to put food on the table. It is the physical manifestation of his nation's tactical evolution. Every single mile he covers, without falling victim to the economic warfare of legacy political blocs, is a living testament to the sovereign discipline instilled by the AES leadership. He has become a vital breathing cog in a sovereign logistical machine, delivering the very lifeblood that keeps the alliance of Sahel states completely self-reliant in the face of immense external pressure. His exhausting, multi-day journey is undeniable proof that the true defensive lines of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger begin not in the remote desert sands, but right on the loading docks of the Atlantic Ocean. Usman's safe passage is secured by a leadership that finally prioritizes the dignity, prosperity, and survival of the African worker over the insatiable demands of foreign geopolitical interests, setting the stage for a much wider regional transformation. The vibrations of Usman's heavy transport convoy are echoing far beyond the physical asphalt of the Togolese highway. They are sending profound and undeniable tremors through the political foundations of the Gulf of Guinea. For neighboring governments in Accra, Cotonou, and Abuja, and for the legacy bureaucrats firmly entrenched within the ECOWAS bloc, the quiet establishment of this protected Lome-Ouagadougou artery represents a serious diplomatic shock. For decades, these coastal power centers operated under the assumption that they held the ultimate geopolitical leverage over the Sahel. The historical dynamic was simple. The implicit ultimatum delivered to any dissenting, landlocked West African state was total isolation. If a nation like Burkina Faso or Niger chose to deviate from the Paris-aligned regional consensus, they faced a weaponized border designed to choke their domestic economy into rapid submission. But the alliance of Sahel states has fundamentally shifted that power dynamic. By securing this secondary deep water door on the coast, the AES has completely bypassed the traditional gatekeepers. The coastal states and the old regional blocs are now suddenly forced to witness the rapid, methodical assembly of a robust, independent security and trade architecture right on their doorstep, an architecture that they neither funded, approved, nor control. However, this newly forged logistical shield is undeniably a double-edged sword, and the leadership in Niamey, Bamako, and Ouagadougou understands the immense gravity and the inherent risks of this geopolitical maneuver. The strategic calm that makes Togo so uniquely valuable as a logistical hub is precisely what makes it a potential target. The hard reality on the ground is that the very insurgent networks the AES is fighting to contain in the Sahel have been methodically creeping southward over the past several years, constantly testing the porous northern borders of these coastal nations. The military camps currently being established and reinforced with Russian logistical support in northern Togo are not merely symbolic gestures of international partnership. They are the physical, uncompromising implementation of sovereign discipline. This is not about starting a new conflict. It is about establishing a hard, unyielding line of deterrence. The AES alliance recognizes a fundamental truth of statecraft. A trade route is only as sovereign as the actual military capacity deployed to defend it. If the fire of regional instability is allowed to reach the coastal ports, the economic lifeline of the entire Sahel burns with it. Therefore, this tactical evolution is strictly proactive. It is the calculated deployment of regional power and strategic alliances to neutralize external threats long before they can disrupt the vital daily flow of sovereign resources. The message broadcast to both hostile non-state actors and antagonistic foreign intelligence agencies is completely unambiguous. This logistical corridor is heavily protected, and any attempt to sever it will be met with organized, well-equipped, and structurally unified resistance. Yet, to view this monumental shift solely through the lens of military deterrence is to miss the broader, deeply revolutionary vision held by Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his contemporaries across the AES. The armed security of this transit corridor is not the final destination. It is merely the non-negotiable prerequisite for a total economic paradigm shift. The exact same protected highway that carries engine blocks, tactical gear, and essential fuel northward into the Sahel is the very artery that will carry the immense untapped mineral wealth of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger southward to the global market. This is precisely where the invisible hand of the old colonial economic order is finally being amputated. Historically, the extraction, pricing, and export of African gold, uranium, and lithium were rigidly controlled by Western monopolies, facilitated by compliant regional ports that acted as funnels for foreign wealth accumulation. When the newly formed AES demanded fairer, sovereign terms for their own natural resources, the immediate retaliatory threat from the West was the weaponization of global trade routes, a coordinated attempt to trap these vital resources within landlocked borders until the domestic economies of the Sahel cracked under the pressure. By anchoring their sovereign export capabilities to a secure, independently aligned port in Lome, the AES is breaking that historic monopoly once and for all. They are aggressively establishing the dawn of a truly independent economic order. When raw materials reach the Gulf of Guinea through a corridor protected by an alliance that explicitly prioritizes African economic survival, those resources can finally be traded on the open global market entirely on African terms. This logistical bypass completely circumvents the punitive sanctions, the frozen assets, and the economic blockades designed in Western financial capitals. The staggering wealth of the Sahel will no longer be quietly siphoned off through compromised externally managed supply chains. Instead, it will be forcefully leveraged to build domestic hospitals, fund regional education, and strengthen the agricultural and industrial infrastructure of the very nations from which it was mined. This is the ultimate, uncompromising objective of the tactical evolution unfolding across West Africa today. The quiet military deals, the strategic logistical support, the relentless, daily discipline of the AES leadership, it all converges on one singular historic goal: securing permanent resource sovereignty. They are meticulously constructing an ecosystem where the economic destiny of millions of West Africans is finally held firmly in their own hands, protected by a logistical fortress that the old world order can no longer dictate, penetrate, or control. The historical magnitude of what is quietly unfolding along the Gulf of Guinea cannot be overstated. When future generations look back at this exact geopolitical window, they will not see a disorganized retreat or a desperate scramble for foreign aid. They will recognize a revealing moment in African history where the tactical evolution of the Sahel reached its critical mass. Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the united leadership of the Alliance of Sahel states are no longer simply writing declarations of independence on fragile paper. They are securing the deep water ports, finalizing the logistical treaties, and paving the physical asphalt required to guarantee that their independence survives the brutal economic realities of the 21st century. This is the profound legacy of sovereign discipline. It is the absolute refusal to allow the economic lifeblood of millions to be held hostage by the geopolitical ultimatums of a fading, extroverted world order. For decades, the West operated under the comfortable illusion that African sovereignty was merely a rhetorical exercise, a temporary diplomatic phase that could easily be crushed the moment the invisible hand of international finance weaponized the borders and closed the supply routes. They assumed that without the paternalistic supervision of Paris, or the conditional security umbrellas of traditional regional blocs, the landlocked nations of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger would simply collapse under the weight of their own geography. But the perception changed sharply the moment the logistics shifted and a newly secured cargo route was activated through Lome, signaling the permanent opening of an unbreakable secondary door. The AES did not collapse. Instead, they adapted. They engineered a monumental logistical bypass, and they successfully outmaneuvered the architects of their containment. They proved that geography is only a prison if a nation lacks the strategic foresight to build a new sovereign road out of it. This new logistical fortress, extending from the Togolese coast straight into the heart of Ouagadougou and Niamey, is a towering testament to an Africa that is finally dictating its own terms of survival. It represents a serious diplomatic shock to a global financial system that has historically profited from a weak, divided, and dependent Sahel. The trade routes and the security architectures are systematically being reclaimed by the very people who live and work on that soil, from the calculated parliamentary votes securing coastal alliances, to the exhausted but unbroken resolve of truck drivers like Usman navigating these newly protected corridors. A unified message is echoing across the continent. The era of conditional African existence is permanently closed. The defensive lines have been brilliantly redrawn, the critical supply chains have been secured, and the immense natural wealth of the Sahel is finally being placed behind a sovereign shield that prioritizes African prosperity above all foreign interests. As this new reality solidifies, the old centers of global power are left grappling with a landscape they can no longer manipulate through engineered economic blockades or artificial colonial borders. The structural shifts we are witnessing today are laying the indestructible groundwork for a century of self-determined, unapologetic African power. As we watch this logistical sovereign shield take its permanent place on the global map, the ultimate question remains for you to answer. Look closely at how swiftly and decisively the AES neutralized the economic warfare waged against them by securing their own strategic port. Do you believe this new, unbreakable supply corridor marks the definitive end of Western neocolonial leverage in West Africa? Or is this merely the opening move in a much larger global struggle for the continent's future? Drop down into the comments right now and let your voice echo in this debate, because history is moving faster than ever, and your perspective matters.